And now we talk about punchy Excalibur, Baruuk. Overall, I find Baruuk's synergies lacking, and his ability flow to be somewhat non-intrinsic to the pace of Warframe, where it seems he's designed to stop killing and wait for enemies to damage him, or for him to try to cast Lull, which is difficult with 3 other killmates on your team. An issue similar to Nidus and Larva, where having teammates feel like you're unable to shine, because anytime you cast Larva, a teammate obliterates the enemies, giving you no stacks. His build, although flexible, doesn't feel impactful with anything other than power string. Going max range for elude, dodging, and lull still makes you vulnerable to AoE and causes you to lose desolate hands more quickly, where you're reducing restraint quicker at the cost of consistent damage reduction. Going max duration means enemies are asleep longer, but it also means you can't recast lull as fast. That being said, I absolutely enjoy playing Baruuk. I find him to do some of the most insane damage in the game and still have decent durability. But he seems to truly shine in high density modes like Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, where you have a consistent source of enemies to manage restraint while still dishing out damage in all directions. Baruuk's passive is Restraint. This resource-based passive provides up to 50% damage reduction depending on the meter's depletion. The gauge is lowered when Baruuk dodges bullet via his first ability Elude, or affects enemies with Lull or Desolate Hands. This passive is also used as a resource to use his 4th ability Serene Storm, which adds back to the gauge. I feel Baruuk's gauge management is one of the reasons many people get turned off of playing him, because his energy sustainability is not an eternal loop. First, you need a consistent flow of energy, meaning Xenuric, Rage, and or Arcane Energize to consistently spam Lull and Desolate Hands to reduce the restraint gauge. Secondly, another pseudo-cooperative kick to the throat is that you need enemies to actually hit with these abilities. I'd say you need the enemies to shoot you for elude, but you're better off just not. Speaking of elude, Baruuk's first ability allows him to dodge enemy fire while not attacking in a radius depending on range with a drain based on efficiency per second active. This is considered a channeled ability, which means it disables all form of energy replenishment over time. Already off to a great start, right? This being a channel ability means energy orbs and or arcane energize is your only method of energy sustain while active. Unless you're using rage, but then I'm not really sure why you're using this ability at all. Unless you're solo, keeping this ability active is just more pain than it's worth, especially since it works counteractively with his many sources of damage reduction. Not to mention, for the full 360-degree coverage, players would need a minimum of 200% range, which causes trouble with Desolate Hands. Lull, Baruuk's second ability, casts a slowing area that eventually lulls enemies to sleep. The field lingers based on duration and cannot be recast until that duration ends. This is the key for restraint management. Using it on cooldown on as many enemies as possible will make it hard for you to gain too much restraint, assuming you have sufficient energy regeneration and enemies to affect. Again, I find this to be a problem in design. A co-op horde-based shooter where you're almost punished because you have allies. His third ability, Desolate Hands, summons a protective circle of daggers, granting 10% damage reduction per dagger to a cap of 90%. These daggers will automatically seek out enemies in range to disarm them, reducing restraint per enemy disarmed. Note that recasting this ability will affect enemies that have previously been disarmed. In this case, you end up recasting whenever you hit 9 daggers, otherwise, much like restraint, this mechanic will leave you unsatisfied because the question of how much damage can you take will be constantly fluctuating. Similar to warding Halo's Augment, consistently attempting to apply this ability to allies becomes an absolute pain in the brain. More often than not, I hit allies with this ability by mistake, when the ability feels as though it should just apply to all allies in range, especially considering the lack of control when it comes to the disarm and damage reduction. Sometimes you just obliterate an enemy right as the dagger is attempting to disarm them, and it feels wasteful. Serene Storm, Baruuk's final ability, grants up to 40% damage reduction when activated, depending on power string, and also the ability to destroy just about anything in your wake with its 50% crit chance, 2x multiplier, and 10 status chance base. Even though it's impact focused, it does an absolute absurd amount of damage in the best way. Now you might be asking yourself, what are Baruuk's synergies? His synergies? While Elude is active, Desolate Hands gains double range, and Desolate Hands daggers don't wake sleeping enemies from Lull. I feel like the ball got dropped here during the design. Of the 4 abilities, we barely got 1 synergy, and the real synergy is that each of his 3 abilities reduce restraint so that he can use Serene Storm. The double range from Elude is actually a double-edged sword, considering the more range you have, the less damage reduction you get to keep, therefore the less quote control you have. On Desolate Hands not waking up enemies, I'll be honest, I wasn't even aware that these things did damage, simply because it's mainly used for restraint and damage reduction. There are some minimal changes that could be done to better Baruuk's flow, such as giving Elude flat damage reduction and or the effect of quick thinking to normalize the ability's effect against a plethora of enemies that deal damage without projectiles. Instead of doubling the range of Desolate Hands, Elude should double the range of Lull and boost the strength of Desolate Hands while active. Equally, Desolate Hands should affect all allies in range or affinity range. For Serene Storm, Elude and Desolate Hands could increase the unknown permanent disarm chance on Desert Wind, and allow the permanent disarm to reduce restraint slightly. Lull could provide Baruuk and allies a temporary attack speed while Serene Storm is active. With these changes in mind, Baruuk isn't entirely punished for taking a more defensive role, ironically enough, should he have more aggressive teammates. But I'd like to also propose a design where Baruuk would mirror Equinox, but instead of 2 forms, he takes on stance switching via his 1, where the rage form of his Elude grants energy on taking damage instead of evasion. Serene Storm could gain double range and be purely crowd control and or disarm, while his more aggressive stance, Raging River, Trampling Torrent, whatever you want to call it, could have Desert Wind's current range with more rapid multi-attacks, like emphasizing the difference between fists and sparring. This change in design could also serve as a template or testing ground for weapons like the Dark Split Sword. Rather than creating new abilities for Lull and Desolate Hands, inverting the stat bonuses to half range double duration on Lull, and double range on Desolate Hands where Desolate Hands marks enemies for bonus melee damage would suffice. But Lord knows there's an image in my mind of Baruuk having 2 types of daggers, 1 Lull area and 1 blazing area. Ugh. This concludes my food for thought involving Baruuk. Please ensure you give the frame a shot, as my critique is only from my perspective and how I play, which may not resonate with everyone. Feel free to comment if you'd like to add to the discussion, or follow on Twitch, as I adore these kinds of talks, seriously. Thank you for your time, and did I mention that his sound design is phenomenal?